you really have to understand the entire chain of technology in play. Do we have an inventory of the data elements that we are going to feed into this model? Do we have an understanding of the flow of the data, both from a technical perspective, from system to system, but also from a cross-border perspective? And being able to associate those sort of incremental or atomic steps and making sure that that's documented in the way that we already have to do.
Hello everyone, I am Sergio Maldonado and this is Masters of Privacy, a set of interviews covering the intersection of marketing, data, privacy and technology with a clear goal in mind, which is redefining the relationship between people, brands and media around transparency and control. Which is to say, we're aiming for real customer centricity, or if you will, human centricity. We regularly talk to DPOs, CMOs, CDOs, and whoever else we find interesting and able to share valuable insights. So we hope you like it. Please do reach out if you have any ideas on future topics or speakers. Very well, we've got Matt Junod here today, and he's a US privacy attorney and Florida native with a prior background in network engineering and security, and a lifelong passion for technology and the law. After becoming a lawyer, Matt has worked in-house, rolling out and managing data protection programs, as well as dealing with security and privacy compliance issues. Matt has served in privacy leadership roles since 2018, including the DPO position for a large technology services firm, and most recently, a leading internet job board. With him, we're going to look at the role of a DPO from a US perspective, as well as the journey to AI governance that starts with putting together a privacy program. Let's go for it. Matt, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Sergio. It's great to be here.
It's a pleasure. What do you think the DPO should be most concerned with? What's the primary role of the DPO from your point of view?
Sure. At least with respect to AI and really anything in the world of data protection, we always have to start with the fundamentals, right? And we're lucky in that the DPO is really a role that has, one of the few roles that exists where there's actually laws that say what our job is. So I always bring it back to that, which is really the Article 39 responsibilities, those tasks. Really, it's to be involved in everything that touches personal information in an organization and how it's being processed. That means having to have a fundamental understanding of everything a company is doing, how it is doing it, and ultimately being able to advise on what the impacts of those activities are. But it's always rooted in fundamentally in the processing of personal information, which gives us a basis to understand other types of data processing that are going on in the organization.
And I see that you adopt a very European, if I can say, approach to this. I mean, DPO is a very neutral role compared to what a chief privacy officer could be, sort of depending, reporting to legal. So how do you see the DPO evolving in the US from a US perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think of it in two components. One is certainly the larger an organization gets or the more international exposure an organization gets, it has to reckon with the fact that it operates in sort of an environment where some jurisdictions are stricter or have more prescriptive requirements than others, meaning a US company that may have not have had to deal with, say, the strict requirements of a DPO, in terms of how it's structured its privacy office, is now going to have to reckon with that as it expands overseas or moves into other markets. So, I think many privacy programs take that high bar sort of perspective when they're building out a global program. And so I think it is incumbent on US privacy officers to understand, what are the structures, what are the ways in which the DPO roles are set up overseas in the EU and in Brazil and in other places, so that you can have a more robust global program to serve the entire business, globally. The other point you touch on, really about the independence, is really a challenging one, I think, and one that not a lot of organizations recognize. That need to have both an operational sort of decision-making sort of leader over data protection and privacy, while also, especially in my prior role, if you're dual hatted, being able to respect that independence and understanding that in some situations that advice that you're giving is not necessarily binding on the company. It is really at an advisory kind of function, and that you have to have that separation ultimately with somebody making those sort of controllership, actual ownership type decisions in and around data processing.
Something that I see was very evolved in the US, and I know that we borrowed some of the concepts in the GDPR from US, practice, is data breaches, data breach notification. There were 50 state, laws for data breaches already. How do you see that interplay with data breach law, cybersecurity?
Yeah, yeah. I think with respect to the DPO role specifically, I have seen organizations take that global approach where even if in the United States there's no real law that says you have to have a DPO that's consulted in the context of a data breach. If you've got one, like say again in the context of Brazil or from an EU perspective, you've got a great in-house resource to consult with on what should you do, not just what does the law say you should do, but taking the perspective of what's the best thing for the organization and the data subject, what's the best thing to do with the whole, sort of context of the situation globally, wherever, your breach obligations may exist. I would say one thing though, I don't know that I would agree that the US is really fully mature in the area of data protection, specifically in breach reporting, because of course we have that 50 state patchwork. We don't have a uniform national reporting standard. And so I think we're actually lagging in that respect in a way that puts American industry a little bit at a disadvantage, certainly with more, friction and transaction costs in assessing breaches in any event.
Good point. How do you see your role if you're already sitting as a DPO and then AI comes into the business? How do you see that?
Yeah. I mean, whether you're an existing DPO or privacy officer or a new one sort of coming into an organization, you always have to do your discovery at the outset. You always have to understand the context of the organization, what's its business and its risk appetite. I think AI is a great opportunity to sort of revisit or reevaluate those questions that you may have thought about from purely a privacy perspective, but to really understand not just what is this company's sort of core business and attributes and how it thinks about data risks in and around human PII, but also data generally. I think it gives us an opportunity to sort of revisit all of that with a more expansive view. And so obviously discovery is always a big part of that. The other good thing is, I think, from the perspective of walking in and just being handed AI or just having that added on to your privacy officer responsibilities, I think the fact that there's so much overlap between AI law and personal data protection law means that you can leverage a lot of the same fundamental processes, whether again that's inventory or risk assessment and reporting. And in any event, you're going to have to carry out a lot of those same activities purely from a privacy perspective because so much AI is based on personal data processing.
I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, the European Commission released the first set of guidelines for general purpose AI. And this is very, very basic or very high level, but that's not something that most of us are going to be concerned with because we're not OpenAI. Instead, we're sitting at our companies and we see some department is bringing a tool. That tool is itself sitting on top of an LLM and it's sitting on top of any of those large providers. So you've got at least three parties already. You've got the LLM, so the general purpose provider. You've got the actual service being acquired or software as a service tool. And then you've got ourselves, if we were to be the enterprise that is using these tools. How do you approach that chain?
Well, kind of going back to fundamentals, whether you're making your own in-house models or buying someone else's models and deploying them in-house, sometimes through an intermediary or otherwise, you really have to understand the entire chain of technology in play in order to be able to evaluate, assess, and mitigate any risks with that technology. That means, again, going back to some of the same actions that we've already had to do and understand under privacy law. Do we have an inventory of the data elements that we are going to feed into this model? Do we have an understanding of the flow of the data, both from a technical perspective, from system to system, but also from a cross-border perspective? And is all of this written down somewhere? Is it drawn in a data flow diagram? Do we have the appropriate documentation to be able to actually understand what's going on under the hood? Because that's one of the most challenging things with AI, is that even many of the people that are designing these things and deploying them in practice don't really have a great, at least today, it seems like don't have a great way of explaining how it's actually all happening from a cohesive whole. So breaking it down into the atomic elements so that you can say, this particular party is responsible for this component, whether it's the collection, the training, or the application, et cetera, and being able to associate those sort of incremental or atomic steps, and making sure that that's documented in the way that we already have to do, in my view, from a data protection law perspective, is a really strong first step. And then once you've identified those risks, of course, then all the normal contractual provisions sort of come into play to help mitigate a company's risk if you're, say, an end user company.
Very makes sense. I think it also makes sense to start assuming that there will be some personal data in there. How about you go deeper into personal data processing once you've got your inventory, your data mapping, your flow, your basic, understanding of the pieces?
Just to say at the outset, I think it's a good assumption, right? Because if a human user is going to be interacting with AI, there's almost a guarantee that there's at least the personal information of the person interacting with it. So we know in almost every case, there's going to be some personal data involved in the processing. So what are the risks and how do we manage those risks? Well, that's driven from what the processing is. In the instance of, let's say, mostly business contact or other sort of low risk personal information, that's going to have a very different profile than, say, collection and processing of health or, say, facial image data, for example. So really, the processing itself sort of drives not just the level of risk, but the kinds of mitigations, right? Like minimization is an often cited control. How much can we minimize the data to sort of minimize the risk of over collection? In my view, a lot of the mitigations themselves are actually mitigations we carry over from good security and privacy practice anyway. Again, minimization of data does not necessarily just apply to PII data. Certainly proprietary business information could be protected better by not storing it more places than you absolutely have to. You have to mitigate, moderate those measures against the company's overall risk appetite and how, say, democratic it wants its data to be available for use by the end users of the AI systems. But I take a view that, again, good data handling practices and the mitigations that come from it are somewhat, I don't want to say standard, but the same kinds of actions, the same kind of mitigations have been around for long periods of time. So we see good practices reinforce and build upon each other for AI.
So now let's say that we want to leverage some certifications out there because it's going to help us do our homework. So we've got wherever we sit in this chain of custody, we may be providers that, for example, sit on top of an LLM that someone else is developing, or someone else has trained and prepared, and now we can plug into that. And so we may be ready to certify under one of the many frameworks. And also we may be the enterprise or the deployer of the technology or the distributor of the technology. And it's going to help us look at those certifications, just as we've done with security, with SOC 2, very popular in the US, ISO 27001, very popular in Europe. Do we have anything that you believe is mature enough for us to start looking at those certifications and not do everything from scratch?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think every organization has to go through its own journey of discovery on what frameworks are going to work best for it. And I divide it into two phases or two different sort of steps. One is developing those core principles around security, privacy, or in this case, the use of artificial intelligence. As FDR said, rules are not necessarily sacred, but principles are. So a company has to understand, an organization has to understand what is its core values with respect to the processing of personal data and the use of AI. Once you've done that, I think, and most people that I talk to would say, you can adopt a framework as a base. It's not the ultimate sort of, it's not the pinnacle, but it's sort of the base of the program. And many companies, many organizations will adopt pieces from different frameworks, whether that's the ISO 42001, which was released, I think, last year, the NIST AI framework. There are others, but a good practice generally is to adopt and tailor those frameworks to an organization-specific context. Not every control applies to every organization, and even when you have a control apply, it might, in context, be more or less significant in a particular organization. I myself think if your goal is certification, obviously the ISO standards are great. However, I do always like to plug the work of NIST. They do great work, and it's very accessible, free. They offer great crosswalks. The only thing I would probably caution, especially in light of sort of recent events in the US, is that obviously NIST is a creature of ultimately of the US government. So whether or not its work is adopted on a broader scale in AI, we'll see. We've seen some indication that the Biden executive order with respect to AI is going to be rescinded. So, I think the core message here is whether that was intellectual property created by NIST or use an ISO standard or some of the other ones that are out there, taking that knowledge and building it into your own company's framework that fits your business the best is usually the best course of action.
Thank you. Yeah, NIST is super helpful. Is there anything that sits on top of NIST as a verification that you comply with their AI framework, for example?
I haven't actually, to be frank with you, I haven't verified, I haven't gone through that service myself yet. But every time a new standard is announced, the audit firms and the consulting firms are waiting in the wings to bring their services. But I will say that one of the benefits to using a framework is the ability to get external verification, whether that's NIST cybersecurity or ISO 27701 for PIMS or whatever the case may be. Being able to get an external party that understands a framework to come into your organization means you're only explaining the differences or the tweaks or the customizations of a framework for your specific context for your organization, not having to explain de novo, an entirely new made up framework that you've developed in-house.
Every organization is releasing some kind of paper or framework or AI governance, and it's just overwhelming. You can count them by the hundreds. So I like the idea that we can stick to a few that we know are digestible and reliable, like NIST. And it's a good point on the Biden executive order in terms of governance in the US and sort of setting a benchmark or, yeah. Okay, so then now we've got both things. We've got privacy compliance and we've got AI governance. And then they start working together. So now we get into the next stage and it gets more sophisticated. Now you've got data subject rights, for example, and people approach you. Is there anything you would do differently, knowing that everything now is going to be touched by some sort of automation? So we can go and follow, Article 22, automated decision making, or we can go and say, well, there's no way I can get back to you on personal data that's in the training data set because I couldn't identify you. So there's going to be a limit as to how you can exercise your rights. Is there anything that changes the way you do your job because of, again, AI sort of messing with every single step of the way?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because, we had that same challenge or set of challenges under traditional machine learning, right? Gen AI is just expanding the problem in terms of scale and velocity, right? It's making that problem more prominent. But many organizations struggled with that, and many organizations, whether even under traditional security principles, had a hard time understanding every element of data that they would have and what they were doing with it. So I think what AI has done is actually accelerate those pre-existing problems. So what I think it means, and again, from a governance perspective, is putting that holistic, not just PII, but data governance function in place to make sure that you're asking the right questions at the design stage where possible. And of course, depending on where you walk in and how mature a company is at the point in time you start this process, going through an understanding of what the risks that already exist are, classifying them, teeing up mitigations, and sort of stack ranking how critical it is to go back and retrofit capabilities and to become compliant. Compliance is a journey, as we say. But I think, using the specific example of data subject rights, I think it's pretty well understood that, data subject rights are here and they're here to stay. And so, if you're a data protection professional, those core activities like data subject rights, being able to, inventory in your algorithm inventory and in your data inventory is what you're doing, being able to explain all of that through your policies. All of those core functions still have to exist. So it's really expanding the PII sort of specific programs that you may have, or the security specific programs you have, into a holistic. Is it data? Are we doing things in an automated manner with it, or in any sense based on automated decision making or AI? And just blowing those programs out, and then obviously reporting on it.
So a couple of things more. One of them is transparency. So trying to align both things, everything that we were doing up to now and how it's been challenged because of the new environment. So when it comes to transparency, there's a few things that we need to tell people when we collect data from them, things that we need to tell them when we collect data from others. And now we're on top of that, overlaying transparency requirements that apply to everybody, no matter how risky the use of AI is.
That's right.
For example, when you look at the AI Act, so transparency is the one thing that applies across the board. So how would you see that? We've got basic requirements, a list of things we need to tell people, and then on top of that, we need to give them basic information as to what we are using. I do not see people being too transparent. I'll tell you, out there, whenever you see a chatbot on a website, I can see the chatbot is listed as a data processor, for example, but I do not see any information as to what it does, right? Or what's powering it.
Yeah. And even if you do get that transparency, even if you do get the information, you may not even have the choice. So what good is transparency if you don't have choice, right? We've seen that. I think it was X just very recently changed their policy around. So
Yes.
you see, what's the good of right? So I think about that. Like, transparency supports choice and preference, but I think the other angle from a transparency perspective is it's not just about the subject with respect to AI. That's kind of the unique and interesting thing about general purpose algorithms and how these AI systems are being built and deployed, is they have an impact beyond that one individual subject who's interacting with your policy or terms. AI systems could have a societal impact. They could have an impact beyond one company, which I think is interesting because our current transparency structures, to me, don't really account for that well, right? Our current systems for informing users through their click-through terms or through your annual email or whatever the case may be don't really address all of the different facets or uses of that AI system. And of course, we do know there's going to be registers of AI systems, of course, in the European Union. But
yeah.
the idea that people are going to go look at these, I don't think is a really fully formed sort of concept, I think, in terms of what your average person would be doing. Hopefully, we'll see other structures, maybe the media, maybe governments come in and sort of handle those aspects. But I do see that as sort of a gap in the way we think about transparency in AI.
Good point. Yeah, this thing with X, I guess we'll add a link to it. But in principle, everything you do will now be used to train their AI model, right? I think that's where you have no choice. And it's happening all over the place. So then the last question I wanted to ask you is about then third parties. So we already touched on that, but that's something else that I see changing as well. So one thing is transparency, because now you need to tell people more because there's all these layers, and you are looking at both data protection and the AI framework. And then now you've the principles that apply to both. And then you've got third parties. So as you audit third parties, and you need to do this due diligence as to data processors or vendors, suppliers, however we want to call them, however any state privacy law would label them. Now, if those third parties are using AI, there's an additional layer here, and it becomes harder and more technical. Are there any tips that you would give us in order to audit third parties when they are AI powered?
Yeah, and I think a lot of the same sort of, again, I'll say this again, a lot of the same sort of skills and attributes for managing security risks and then privacy risks apply in AI, but it requires more and a deeper technical expertise. You need an audit team that really understands how these things work, has to be able to really pick apart the different components of the flow, whether again from a cross-border perspective or from a purely technical perspective. It also means, I think, going back to what I said before about principles versus frameworks, right? You can audit for compliance with the law or a relative, degree of compliance with a framework, but ultimately those findings are going to be distilled into something that an organization's leaders are going to use to make sort of risk decisions in line with its principles, in line with its risk appetite. So being able to keep both of those things in mind at the same time requires a very talented group of compliance professionals to work on third-party compliance.
Thank you. Any tips that you would give to someone that is now about to embark in the profession?
Yeah, it's striking for me because somebody who started really in a very technical role and sort of morphed into other things over time. I have myself struggled to keep up with the pace of change in all of this, and not just the pace, but the sort of explosion in breadth, right? And I think what that means is, as professionals in this space, we have to have a sense of humility and grace, and be very understanding that where we're at in any one point in time is going to be fluid and will be for the foreseeable future. It will only, I think, accelerate. So certainly patience is going to be a virtue for somebody, understanding that they're not going to be able to sort of know everything, and to rely on trusted colleagues, trusted members of your team to develop expertise on particular topics is going to be a coping skill, I think, for many. But for any organization, they're all struggling with this, the pace of change, the amount of new laws, the amount of regulation, the uncertainty of regulation. So it's certainly just, I think, going to call basic professional attributes like patience and, as I said, humility to the fore.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, that's all for today. Please follow the Masters of Privacy channel on LinkedIn if you want to find some interview transcripts, cheat sheets, and other useful resources and surprises every now and then. On top of that, episode notes and other feeds are available on mastersofprivacy.com. Thank you for listening.